hello to everyone tuning in on Zoom, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill Political Panel Live. My name is Libby Davies, and I'm joining you from the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam Coast Salish peoples. My co-host, Robin Brown, is unfortunately unavailable to join us tonight, but he will be joining us again next time. So with us tonight, our former NDP Member of Parliament for Toronto, Danforth Craig Scott, poet and activist Elle Jones, community organizer and political commentator Jennifer Arp, and Rabble's senior parliamentary reporter Karl Nerenberg, who will actually be joining us shortly. He's just finishing up watching the French leaders debate tonight. So welcome to everybody. Welcome also to our audience who are joining us on Zoom. We hope that you'll participate in the chat and ask questions to our panelists through our Q&A function. We'll certainly do our best, as always, to answer and address your questions. So let's get started. Well, here we are. We are in week 4 of the federal election campaign with 12 days to go before Election Day. And really, an election like no other. Threats to Canadian sovereignty issued almost daily by an increasingly fascist leader south of our border, a global community full of unease and anxiety and conflict, and growing inequality at home. Well, that does sound very gloomy indeed, but the context of this federal election is also about growing resistance from social movements and ordinary people who are fighting back and speaking out like never before. So let's get started on a hopeful note. And I'd like to begin by asking each of our panelists, Canadians are finding their own unique and active ways of pushing back in the face of trade tariffs, Trump's rhetoric, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and broader threats to democracy and social justice in Canada. So in the context of a federal election, what do you make of this moment? Give us your opening thoughts of the times that we're living in. And let's begin with you, Craig. What does it feel like for you right now?
Thanks so much, Libby, for turning to me. Well, I think I would say that, along with maybe most people, that there's been an organic, quite spontaneous coming together around what it means to be Canadians, and along the lines of a broad vision of Canada and its values, even if it's been framed as a reaction to the dangerous, threatening US. And so that's been heartening, somewhat unexpected, but also inspiring. The focus on the Trump regime has, I think, crowded out some other big picture, bigger vision issues being discussed as such as those issues. Housing might be the exception almost. Everything gets refracted through that. At the same time, it's kind of enabled those visions. We've been shaken out of what I would call a kind of a classic Canadian complacency around on a whole range of fronts. And there's tentative, embryonic efforts to bring it all together into a big picture of what the future looks like. That's good. Strangely enough, silver lining. The other thing I would note is there's a measure of solidarity-oriented instincts that have really taken hold that could, and I emphasize could, I don't say will, lead to different ways to think about how we govern, how we do politics, etc. It's not impossible that would happen. I'm not going to give it odds. My only downside is I think there's just been a tiny bit of too much of a focus on us, as in Canadians in Canada, insufficient attention to what's happening to the US and our need to show solidarity with Americans in their resistance. Same goes for the threats against Greenland, against Gaza. It's not all about us. And I'm not sure we've taken part in the global debate that well.
Okay, thanks for that. Very thoughtful. Elle, let's have you weigh in just how you're feeling about the times we're in within this context of the federal election.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, obviously we're at a time with very serious issues. We all know that economic issues like the cost of food, the cost of housing, the inability to find housing. At the same time, I feel from my point of view, it feels like politics has performed like the political theater is increasingly out of step with how people actually experience politics. I don't think I myself have ever been as alienated from an election campaign um, as I am on this one. Like in some ways, I feel like I couldn't care less because not one of these parties is stepping forward, for example, to speak out for Palestinian life. How are we 18 months into a genocide and it's still controversial if Carney is asked, to obey international law, something as simple as that. And that becomes discourse in our media around, oh no, did he say it was genocide? Oh no. So when we're still there, I find it increasingly difficult to really engage with what is really just a form of political performance, right? So, what Desmond Cole always calls the horse race, like there's all this media that's generated this sort of false, like, oh, now this person's ahead in the polls. Oh, now we got to put this story about the false buttons, because maybe the liberals are getting too far ahead in the polls. So now we need to create a debate so that it's exciting. And it's like this, symbiotic cycle of the news and politics that just generates this discourse that is more or less meaningless. We're supposed to celebrate Carney, who's moving ever further to the right, as usual, the same dynamic we've seen in the States, where we're supposed to be so scared of the conservative / Republican boogeyman that we cede all progressive ground on the idea that like this is the responsible and mature and adult thing to do, so therefore we shouldn't talk about Palestine, or we shouldn't talk about economic justice, or race is off the table now. We're definitely not talking about racial justice anymore. Indigenous, like where we've really just ceded all that progressive ground because now we're just scared of Polyev. And I agree, I am scared of Polyev as well. But when the liberals are picking up conservative talking points around crime, around bail, around parole, in order to outflank the conservatives, then what are we left with? And this is dynamic we've seen in the US that has led us to where we are. So I don't think we can ignore the fact that a big part of the position that we're in right now is because of our complacency on Palestine. When we were willing to accept, students being beaten down by police for speaking up about Palestine and genocide, when we were willing to accept from our politicians complete inaction, as we continue to be willing to have our countries disrespect and violate international law, send weapons, and can't even get a position on that. Now we see what's happening in the States. Of course, it's inevitably coming to everyone. It'll be the same for us. So I find it, I suppose, just very difficult to
Mm,
uh, feel like this election is going to be meaningful for any of the issues that actually
okay.
matter to me. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to follow up briefly, Elle, do you feel though that in terms of social movements and people who are active politically outside of political parties or even within a political party, that there is an increased measure of resistance, awareness, mobilization going on? Or do you feel that that's also
Um,
uh, kind of not doing it for you?
People are mobilizing, but in a lot of
Yep.
ways, people are demobilized. I think one of the, not to like harp on Palestine, I guess, but one of the sort of depressing things is when you talk to people personally, as we're seeing showing up in surveys, the majority of people support Palestine or at least recognize that what Israel is doing is wrong, yet that is not reflected
Mm,
in media, in our politics. So there's a massive disconnect between how ordinary people think and feel and the elitist politics that is increasingly not responding to how people
right.
think. And so I will say that, like, as small as it is, like, I actually like, I mean, I suppose it's the most Canadian thing I'll ever say, but, when we're in the grocery store and there's the Canadian, like things on the groceries and everybody's buying them, like, I do feel that's a political move, and that normal, ordinary people, if we can get them there, maybe that can also start a conversation about
Yep.
labor and about other things related to production of food, for example, which also includes the environment. So,
Yeah.
there's hopes for that, but no, I'm
Okay.
pretty
Yeah, well, I think you've touched on a theme that we speak about a lot on Off the Hill, and that is the connection or disconnect between the social movements and activism and what goes on in the formal world of politics. So this is something that we come back to again and again. So let's bring you in, Jennifer. Just the question of how is this federal election looking to you in this extraordinary times that we're in as it relates to average people and whether they're activists or how they're engaged? Are you feeling like there is better engagement, or are you feeling like that disconnect still is very much there?
So it's funny. And thank you for the question. This is the probably in my entire adult life, this is the election that I've been the least engaged in.
Hmm.
Which is funny because we're dealing and grappling with really, really big, serious issues, not like beyond Trump, beyond tariffs, beyond the economy, really about the future and the shape of our country. And I'm choosing to have conversations outside of traditional political party environment, right? To educate my kids. You know, my oldest is voting for the first, like it's the second time voting because we had a provincial election here in February in Ontario, but it's his first federal election. And so, you know, helping him understand the issues and where he may align and helping him through his own anxiety so that he can then go forward and help his friends do the same. And you know, for me, I look at the next generation as an incredible opportunity to help shift the conversation in our country so that we are talking about more progressive issues. I do, as you know, I'm a lifelong liberal. Although I did manage an NDP campaign in the last federal election. You know, I am concerned by the party shift to the right. You know, and I know we are.
Come back to that for sure.
Yeah, we can come back to that for sure.
We're going to ask you about that. We're going to ask
Liberals are a big tent,
Yep.
but I sit
Yep.
on the progressive side of the party, and I do worry that important issues around race, around gender, Indigenous rights, all of those things are missing from the conversation in this federal election. And I'm not the only one that feels that way. You know, in my circle of friends, regardless of political party, there's a general feeling of political leaders aren't talking to the issues that I care about or that my social circle cares about or that my friends care about or my family. And I think, you know, there's a real opportunity for those of us that have historically been engaged to really try to reignite conversation and look at how we reshape politics so that we're actually working and doing things for the people that live in this country. And
Yeah, well, thank you all for being so honest about how you feel about things are right now. You know, it's easy to just sort of say, oh, well, you know, it's an election, you know, let's get on to that. But it's refreshing to hear your comments. But we will get into some questions about the federal election. And I'm actually going to come back to you, Craig. You're a former NDP Member of Parliament, and you're also someone who, since you left Parliament, you're still active. I know you've been pushing for greater unity amongst Canada's progressive parties, and in fact, this has also been a subject of discussion at some of the off the Hill panels over the last couple of months. So something that I know a lot of people are talking about. But I really want to zero in on how you see things playing out in this election. And of course, I have to ask you, especially with the growing media narrative, that the NDP could once again be squeezed out, squeezed down to nothing, some people say, by strategic voting. So to be specific, what kind of an outcome are you anticipating for this election?
With only 10 days to go, you know, I don't want to play into this. It's all pretty static narrative as well. But 10 days, things can happen. So I really don't want to predict. Here are my fears. My fears are that the Conservatives are still remarkably high in the polls for what they represent and what their leader in particular represents. And the hearing about the general kind of distanciation, alienation from the politics of this election does worry me, that there is a subterranean factor that could still push people to the polls, the kind of factor that actually pushed Donald Trump over the top in a different kind of race. So I have that worry. I have that worry that that 37 might turn into a floor. And keep in mind that 37 to 38 was all Harper needed for a majority in a different configuration. It's a high number for the Conservatives. I think the NDP being squeezed is real. It's real because the discourse is driving it, but it's also real because the generic overall polling numbers can't be that far wrong in terms of seat projections and individual seats. That's an issue. We have just a handful of seats that are just not even quite safe, but just extremely likely. And we've got a bunch of seats that are in head-to-head, like toss-up, 1 to 2 to 3 percentage points likely. And we probably have the nose in those, just because of the NDP ground game and incumbents and things like that. So I'm not expecting down to 0, but I'm expecting it to be a fight to get to the 12 that is official party status. And I honestly hope that some elements of the Ontario NDP strategy of quietly in the background focusing a lot of on-the-ground attention to a smaller subset of ridings is going on. I expect it is, but it will be that can pull the iron from the fire, so to speak, and get the NDP up into the 8, 9, 10, 11 range, and maybe over 12. But we're not competitive in even all of the number of seats we have in Parliament right now. That's just what the squeeze has produced. And I would be one, I'm probably the first one to call for a major government of national unity and resolve back in around January 10th. It was because I foresaw exactly what began to happen, not the details. Who could imagine the details?
So you weren't actually in favor of an election being called. You would have rather seen a unity type government. Yeah.
No, absolutely not. I would have wanted us to build up a much more cooperative national government framework and gone no earlier than June, if not waiting for the time that the election was needed. I would have embraced, when we say progressive, I would have embraced the gamut, including actively suggesting former cabinet ministers of the more reasonable sort, Lisa Rates of the world, for example, to be part of this. Nobody jumped on it, although it produced a lot of discussion. And I actually think the NDP missed majorly. It's a hindsight thing. At the time, I felt it was an opportunity for us to stand up and say, in the interest of Canada and the need for national unity and what we foresee coming down the pipe, we are going to take the lead, even though our leader did say he's going to use the first opportunity to bring down the government.
Yeah.
And I did say that was precipitous.
I remember you saying that.
It is precipitous, and there was a chance for the NDP to reorient things before the Carney factor became clear. The only clear Carney factor was what was going on inside the Liberals. It was not at all clear that the Carney factor was going to produce what it has produced.
Okay.
And I think we're not the author of our own squeeze in the sense of who can predict exactly the dynamics, but we're now in a box partly because we didn't seize the initiative when we could have.
Yeah. Well, here we are now in an election. So obviously that's well underway. And I see that, Karl, you've joined us. Thank you so much. We know that you were watching the French leaders debate. It was very interesting. I saw the beginning of it. We're just going to let you catch your breath, Karl, and I'll go to Jennifer next. And Jennifer, you touched on this in your opening remarks in terms of, where the Liberal Party is at. And it's been very interesting to see because certainly Mr. Carney is continuing to climb in the polls, even as he seems to embrace policies that benefit more wealthy people. We know he scrapped the consumer carbon tax. He's cancelled the capital gains tax increases. I think that was the first thing he did as prime minister. And now he's pledging to balance the budget in just 3 years, which could mean a cut of around $43 billion, according to the Parliamentary Budget Office. That would be presumably to public services and social support. So I think there is a real question if he's shifting the burden onto everyday people. How can he claim to stand with those being hardest hit by rising costs in the US tariffs? I mean, I'm not asking you to speak for the Liberal Party, just give your own opinion, but obviously you're concerned too that there is a shift taking place. And what does that mean?
Yeah, I already did allude to it. I am concerned how swiftly the Liberal Party has moved to the right. And I think there are a lot of voices within the party themselves that are being squeezed out with that shift. Even just the move to not have Karina Gould included in cabinet. I think for those of us that sit on the left side of the party are really, really concerned about what a Carney government could mean for individuals in Canada. There are glimmers of hope. Not all is lost. I think we're looking at some interesting proposals on the housing front that could expedite and speed up the rate at which we're building housing in Canada, which I think is a positive. We all know we're desperate for housing. You've seen the expansion of dental care immediately as well. So another good thing, talk about skilled workers and support for skilled workers and paying for education for skilled workers, interprovincial trade, conservation of our natural environment. All of those things are great. We have 10 days to go. we'll see what other announcements come as we get closer to the day. But I do think that the economy is taking up so much airtime that people aren't thinking beyond what's happening right now. And there's a lot of anxiety. And Trump's a real factor in this election. And Trump's a real factor in the Liberal Party's move to the right as well. Yeah. Right. To try to build that tent, in a lot of ways, the left side of the party, we're a pretty loyal bunch. Not gonna lie, like those of us that are left of center tend to stay with the party, and so that shift, I think, is intentional to try to take as much support from the Conservatives as possible. And the polls show right now that it's working. What that means, especially for in a majority government territory, what that means for the next 4 years, I'm not sure. When Prime Minister Carney has to go to a Liberal convention for the first time and talk to members about their policy ideas and what they see in the future, we could see a shift.
Yeah, he hasn't faced that yet, obviously.
He hasn't faced a lot of hard things.
Yeah.
Very short time as Prime Minister.
Well, I think you've reflected on it's a very dynamic balance when you mentioned dental care as one of the good things. I mean, that basically happened because the NDP pushed it. If the NDP's there, we might get more stuff like that. If they're not there, it may go more to the right. I mean, I think this is what I find so fascinating about the whole strategic voting and how it plays out, and what the balance of forces are in Parliament. So let's bring in Karl here. Karl, I mean, just for you to give us your reflections. You've covered elections for, well, I guess decades, and certainly in your time here at Rabble. How are you seeing the key issues right now and how it's playing out?
But I think it's very true that Canadians view this election quite differently than any election I've experienced watching elections in my life, which I suppose started in something vaguely resembling a serious way in 1962. So that's a long time ago. And normally an election is about, to some extent, where we're tilting one way or the other. And occasionally it's about maybe choosing a more radical shift. I think that happened to some extent in 2011. It wasn't choosing between, it happened a couple of times. It happened maybe in 1988. This election, Canadians generally, I think, are starting to think of it as about the survival of the country as we know it, and the survival of the country on the basis that is shared across a broad ideological and regional spectrum. Not entirely. The regional spectrum has more differences than the ideological spectrum, and I think that I mean, quite legitimately, it's hard to imagine something more scary and worse that when an openly fascist president of the United States says he wants to take the country over and deprive us of our independence and our sovereignty. At first, we had a previous panel here where I was talking very, very much about that, and others thought that may not be such a big issue, including Jennifer. I mean, I'm not criticizing you, but people felt this was ephemeral, and the people felt this was temporary. People felt that the election campaign, when it come, would be a traditional election campaign about the issues such as the cost of living and how people felt about their own personal security. And I think Canadians overall, when I talk to people in supermarkets and talk to people on buses and subways, when I talk to people in the street and neighbors, what people say is, we have many, many differences as a country, but we don't want to be not a country. We don't want to be part of we don't want to be a vassal state of the United States. I mean, that is a huge issue. So Mr. Carney has profited from that because he seemed like a sober, steady, reassuring, capable person. And he was in some ways. The minute he became leader, he started to say things like, we'll talk to them, the Americans, as long as they express respect for our sovereignty and stop this nonsense. And it seemed to be vaguely working, or it's hard to tell. But in the whole process, curiously, he is making a semblance of moving to the right. I speak to liberals in the party who say, yes, I think he's moving to the right. I'm not so sure I'm crazy about it. Of course, I'm sticking with him. Anyway, I spoke the other day to a very well-known progressive writer who ran for the NDP in a Toronto riding at one time, has written many books. I happened to run into her, believe it or not, on the streets of Paris. And we've known each other for a long time. And she says, oh, I'm all for Carney, or almost all for Carney. I don't worry about what will happen to the NDP. Maybe the NDP will come, because it's less important right now. We have a fascist president of the United States, and we have a mini fascist leader of the Conservative Party. We absolutely must keep him out of office. And we absolutely, and I don't really worry about what will happen to the NDP. I worry more about keeping out the fascist, the mini little fascist of the Conservative Party. So I don't know if these debates will change anything. Carney was having a lot of trouble with his French in this debate, but even Polyev was making a lot of mistakes. So I mean, there was actually the only person who spoke fluent French in that debate was Blanchet of the Bloc Québécois, who was only seeking seats in 78 riding. So I think it's a completely different world that we're living in. I don't think this is a minor issue in any sense whatsoever. I think that the danger and threat that an openly fascist, this is a government that's rounding up people and sending them to concentration camps.
Yeah.
Like,
okay.
This is not a joke.
Karl, we're going to come back to this. So thank you for those kind of opening comments about how you see things. And I'm glad you were in on watching the French leaders debate. I look forward to what you write about it on your column. I'd like to come back to Elle now and just sort of take it to a larger stage. Because we've focused a lot, and certainly the election campaign has focused so much on either the trade war issue or what's happening in Canada, as it should. But of course, we're also part of the global community. And so, this is something that Rabble always pays attention to. And I think our listeners and readers pay attention to is, what is our place in the world? What are we doing? What responsibility do we take, or what do we abdicate or ignore? So, Elle, just to bring you in on this, with the rising global instability and growing concerns about Canadian sovereignty, what role do you think Canada should play on the world stage after the election? What would be a relevant, realistic role for us to play?
I mean, I think outside of Canadians' own beliefs, we are like largely irrelevant on the world stage. We don't like to admit it. But anytime you go anywhere as a Canadian, like nobody gives a shit, like Canada in terms of the geopolitical. Now, that used to be our argument, right? So the argument, for example, that we used to use through the 90s, particularly around peacekeeping, was that like America was the evil empire, and we were able, as precisely because we were like this medium nation, we were able to navigate between the big powers, and we were able to offer something else. That used to be our kind of calling card. But we have consistently been the junior partner to the US, which is part of the problem now, right? That we have gone along with American foreign policy consistently. We went to Iraq, we went into Afghanistan on their behest. We've always fallen in line with, America on China, America on Russia, whatever. America's enemies are our enemies. We need more funding for NATO, all these things that are now being shifted as America. What did we get for that? America turned on us like Trump said he was going to invade us. So what is that? And then we went around crying about how we were America's best friend and how could they do that to us? Well, we never should have been America's best friend, because America has been a global force for evil for decades and has destabilized this planet like entirely on every measure, whether that's environmentally, war, economically. And those of us who, have any ties in the global south are not disillusioned about what America has meant. So again, in this moment, I think, I wouldn't say for everyone, part of the sort of theater of foreign policy is no one understands anything about it. So we just like perform it, like who's the enemy of the day. And then you get up on stage, you go, you like China. No, you like China. And then like nobody knows anything about China. and it's just a performance that's like supposed to be about, are we manly? Are we bellicose? Do we have pride as a nation? That has like literally nothing to do with anything to do with actual China. So our problem is always, when we discuss foreign policy, is people don't even know where to find these countries on a map, and then we're having a foreign policy debate. But for those, I think slowly again, I mean, if we didn't prove it with our complete hypocrisy and disgusting behavior on Israel, we said we stood for international law, and then when, like, nobody's arresting Netanyahu. We are, taking the case of Rohingya genocide to the ICJ and then saying genocide doesn't have to mean, like in that case, we say genocide doesn't mean that you destroy the whole population, then turn around and make the exact opposite arguments on Israel. Our behavior at the UN, we're completely out of step with the vast majority of the globe. We have engaged in political repression, not to the extent of the US, but I think, we're seeing how we're aping that, right? So, I mean, how can we have any credibility on foreign policy when we have gone down the exact same path? And then in terms of us talking about, the shift to the right, we've always seen that centrist parties would rather lose to the right than win with the left. That's always been the case. And that is what has sunk the Democrats and made them completely irrelevant. And I hope Canada isn't going down. We've always sort of gone down that path, but we've seen the Democrats have aggressively cut off their left wing. And then whenever they lose, even though they're losing with the centrist right policies, they blame the left wing even further. Like, oh, if you guys hadn't said you wanted to defund the police and I used pronouns, maybe you wouldn't be Trump, which is like this complete ridiculous capitulation to a bullshit culture war. So what actually happens is, as we see you move to the right, people would rather vote for a real right winger than a fake one. So all the actual conservatives continue to vote conservatives. The progressives are actually pushed out and like either don't vote and then are made irrelevant in these parties. And then these parties turn around and blame the progressives even further and move even further to right, which forces the right even further to the right. And we end up with far right and medium right. Like that is what we've seen in the US. And I hope we're not repeating that pattern in Canada, but we know that they don't learn. So of course we're repeating that pattern in Canada. So I think what's concerning is no matter who's in, is we're on a huge rightward slide where, again, like, where no matter who we get, we're getting anti-immigrant, we're getting anti-labor, anti-union, we're getting anti-environment, anti-indigenous, anti-black. Like that is just with like no sense of dialogue. So yeah, I mean, I'm sort of just ranting now, but as you can tell, I'm frustrated and angry because I mean, it's just like we're in Holy Week. I don't know how many people are Christian or whatever. I'm obviously looking at the news from Palestine. We're watching on Palm Sunday. Israel yet again massacred people. We're now in Holy Week. I get the news from Palestine about what's happening in Palestine as the church celebrates, as we move to Easter in the Holy Land, as Christians are massacred. And then we have what's the big issue in Canada? Oh, there's advanced polls that are allowing voting on Good Friday, and like, let's be outraged about that. Why don't we be outraged about Christians being wiped off? If you're a Christian, why don't you be outraged about nuns being sniped at in Gaza? Like, if you are actually Christian, why don't you care about that? But we're going to care that there's voting on Easter Monday. Like, this is the degree of disconnect in our politics that is so infuriating and anti-life and anti-human that it's just hard to stomach.
Okay, Elle, wow. I mean, I think you kind of reflect a lot of the frustration and the complexity and just the feeling overwhelmed that a lot of people feel, like where to even begin, right? So in 12 days, Canadians are going to be making a choice about a new parliament and a governing party, possibly, or it could be a minority parliament. We don't know. So, I mean, I think all of you have just kind of demonstrated very well, just like the overload, almost the overload of the agenda, and trying to make sense of where we are and what each of us can do to make sense of it and how we vote. So I'm going to now bring it back to almost like the minutiae and just ask you on a quick go around before we go to questions from the audience, if you don't mind, and if you can, give us your predictions about what you think is going to happen on April the 28th. What do you think Canada's parliament will look like? And maybe more importantly, because, we are trying to open up discussion here with people, what do you want it to look like, even with all of its limitations of our non-proportional system, first past the post and all of that? What do you want it to look like that would be in the best public interest? So why don't we come back to Craig, and then we'll go to Jennifer and Karl and Elle. So Craig and then Jennifer.
Yeah, I've kind of said already, I don't want to get too much into the prediction stuff. So I'll go to what do you want it to look like?
Yeah, okay, tell us what you want. What would be a good thing for us to see?
For Pierre Poilievre to lose his own seat. That's
okay.
the first thing. and possibly give that party a chance to recalibrate back towards something resembling reasonable discourse. I'm an odd one. I want to see enough other parties winning in Alberta to take the edge off this monolithic sense that Alberta represents one bloc, and let alone one that for which Danielle Smith speaks. In that respect, the NDP is got a couple of ridings, one that they will take, one that, frankly, I think the Liberals should try to help them take. And if the Liberals get 4 to 5 seats in which they're running head to head, that will be a good result.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of the NDP, I absolutely want them to get to 12 or more, of course. Nobody wins if the NDP is not an official party. Nobody wins if the NDP is not there to be pushing in some form. And I hope, frankly, for a minority government again. I want the NDP there to hold Mr. Carney and his party to account on things like housing, on Indigenous centrality to our economy and governance, to the climate crisis, and to preventing creeping fascism that is going to continue to eat away and feed on alienation that still is not going to go away after this election. And something like to also be part of a serious discussion about where defense and security goes, where multi-use is absolutely central to what we think about. Firefighting, Coast Guard, search and rescue, all the things, northern representation, where you have multitasking forms of military and civil combined, and not just think of this as all about warfare capacity. So I'm hoping for a minority Liberal government where the NDP's number of seats, whatever they are, and let's say hope they're 12 plus, again, make the difference.
Okay, thanks for that. And Jennifer, what kind of outcome would you like to see?
Yeah, I'm going to do that rather than the prediction. I have a lot of anxiety about polls and where things are and what, and you know, I just, it's hard to believe when I live in the riding that I live in. So my hope would be to see, oh, if Poilievre lost his own riding, wouldn't we would all be celebrating and screaming from the rooftops, I think. You know, I think Conservatives lose ground would be a really good outcome. Breaking through in the prairies, other parties, Liberals, NDP, I think is really important. Because I think for a long time we talked about, oh well, the Liberals, you know, we need Ontario and Quebec and Atlantic Canada, and sort of the rest of the country kind of gets forgotten. And I think, you know, there's important conversations to have around that. I didn't want an election. I said that when I was here 2 months ago. I think the parties should have worked together and come together and get back to work with the election of a new leader. I kind of liked what was going on. I liked the NDP holding the Liberals to account and forcing progressive issues to be included in government programs, government spending, in the budget, all of those things. And so for me, something resembling the status quo, I think, would be a really positive outcome.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. Karl, fairly briefly, because we've got quite a few questions coming in that I think you guys might want to address. So, Karl, what kind of outcome would you like to see?
So I'm going to do the first part of your question, which is more.
Okay, do the prediction.
I think as a journalist, I should try to be. Journalists never should predict, but I'll go out on a limb here and say it's going to be likely a rather narrow Liberal majority, not an overwhelming Liberal majority, and the Conservatives are going to do rather well, despite what we've been thinking up until now. Although mostly they'll do well by hanging on to their bastion in the West, in the 3 prairie provinces. I think, unfortunately, things are, unless the NDP can pull, can double what the Ontario NDP did by focusing on the ridings they already hold and a few other winnable ones, and keep parliamentary status, they may be down to a 1993 result. And the Bloc should lose some seats as well. Looking at the debate tonight in French, I don't think it's going to make a difference. I think it's kind of a wash, and the whole thing was kind of a blur and a muddle, and I don't think people were able to follow it too much. I think tomorrow's debate in English will have more impact. I will say, in terms of quickly, what I would want is, I mean, the ideal feasible solution would be for the Liberals to be a few seats short of a majority, and the NDP to give them enough seats to bring them to a majority, even if it's fewer than 12. I mean, they could be 8 seats short of a majority, but if the NDP have those 8 seats, then there might be an incentive even for Carney to say, well, let's bring you guys directly in. Maybe Carney's point of view, well, we'll absorb your party completely. I mean, there's a fact we have to recognize here. Most of the gain in Liberal support in the opinion polls has come from the NDP, not the Conservatives. It's hard to know what do we subtract from. Some polls had the Conservatives as high as mid 40s. Most of them had them in low 40s. Now they're in mid to high 30s. So there's not much that they gained. But I remember when the polls had the NDP from 18 to 20%, they were tied with the Liberals at one point, around 18, 20, 21%. Now the NDP's, the best poll they get is 11%. So, the NDP seems to have lost easily half of its support, if not more. The polls may be all wrong, and we can hope so. On the other hand, I think when I talk to a former NDP candidate who probably won't vote Liberal, but is quite comfortable and hopeful that Carney wins, I can see what's happening here. Maybe it's I think people have different views. That Elle enunciated a view of Canada as kind of a mini evil empire. I don't share that Elle's perspective, but be perfectly blunt and honest about it. I think Canada is a very different kettle of fish. I've lived in the United States. I have family there, and I think that the existential situation that we're facing is really grave and serious. And I think we made a huge mistake in this country over the last 70 years and becoming way too integrated with the United States for many decades, since my childhood. And my childhood was in the 1950s. Louis Saint Laurent, C.D. Howe and Louis Saint Laurent started it, going way back to my childhood. And I'm the only one in this panel who was born in the 1940s.
Okay, let's get Elle in on this. I'm gonna actually ask you a slightly different question, rather than predictions than that. I'm sure you've been monitoring and watching with horror Mr. Poilievre's pronouncements on, his get tough on crime stance, just like Stephen Harper. In fact, even worse, 3 strikes you're out, threatening to use the notwithstanding clause, which no prime minister has ever done. So, even if Poilievre doesn't win, I mean, if he does win and we get that stuff, it's going to be pretty horrible. But even if he doesn't win, I'm just interested in your take on what it means in terms of the criminal justice agenda and what it means for people who are already incarcerated or people who are marginalized and at threat of being incarcerated because of their social conditions and these kind of shift to the right on the so-called law and order agenda. What are you thinking about that and where it's at?
Yeah, well, there was that hilarious document where somebody was like, I'm a prison guard and I've uncovered this document from like Elections Canada telling prisoners not to vote conservative, which was fake. But I mean, prisoners don't vote conservative. That is very much they vote liberal. And that's the thing that the committees go around and doing because they don't want the conservatives in because everybody knows what Harper did. Some of which Trudeau promised to address and then never did. For example, parole. So when Trudeau came in, I remember going into prison in 2015 and they were really hopeful around like getting back programs, getting back funding. And there was this really brief period where they were really open to volunteers. And then when it became apparent that Trudeau actually wasn't going to live up to that, you saw a lot of reversion. And of course, we've already seen like bail reform, which has accepted this narrative that everyone's getting out on bail and murdering people or whatever. We have a completely closed parole system that is not accountable to anybody. The conditions inside our prisons have been increasingly deteriorating and are short staffed as well beyond like I remember when like people used to be out 10 hours 14 hours a day. Now you're lucky if you can get phone calls from people like once a week because they're just not out, they're locked down. So I don't think people know anything about the conditions in and I think more worrisome is I think it's always a reflection of the general rising level of human cruelty in our society, which is in, not only in prisons, but in people freely saying deport people under like every quote tweet, every time. That's just become now the refrain: deport them, including citizens, but truly means like non-white citizens. And so, when you see people saying stuff like, well, why should prisoners vote anyway? We need to undo that. That's a measure of how we treat each other. So, yes, of course, there's a direct impact on what the prison policy is and like things. And I will give the liberals that, because my sister wrote it, the Black Justice Strategy, which was recently released and is supposed to be providing a roadmap, for example, to decarcerating Black people, shifting the way we do justice. Obviously, that's not going to happen under the Conservatives. We know that.
Mhm.
But I think so beyond like the actual impact on prisons, which as we know is like no matter what government, there's never any political will to like, bring up prisoners because that's just not a popular thing. Like unless you have some kind of moral outlook, it's always the electorate is always so called tough on crime because there's a lot of fear mongering around that. But beyond that, I think it's a measure of our general rising in humanity, our rising disconnect from each other. I think online has made it really easy to condemn all sorts of people to cruel fates and feel disconnected from that. And that it does not just stay online. I think it really is impacting how people are relating to each other. And more than anything, like the politics of cruelty is what's at play here. And we have to find ways to reverse that, to be more humane to each other, more compassionate to others, because we're seeing that in every sector of life. Like there's something going on with us. We are really losing as a human family, the connection to each other's humanity. And that's what's driving this political shift.
Okay, thanks for that, Elle. Well, look, we've got some time to get to audience questions, and we've had a few coming in. And the first one, and I'm going to just suggest that maybe one or two of you answer, so we can get through some. The first one actually is something that you touched on, Craig, earlier about defense spending. And the question that's come in is, why are none of the parties proposing a decrease in military spending? What could be more anti-Trump patriotic move than that?
I mean, I'll just jump in quickly because
Okay.
For Craig, obviously, Canadians in general feel that we have to probably spend more on the military, but less on an integrated way with the Americans. So that there's serious talk now about replacing the U.S. fighter jet with a Swedish or French fighter jet. It's ridiculous. We're not going to be able to. The problem is we're not going to be able to militarily defend ourselves against the United States that's more than 10 times bigger than us and has the largest military in the world. But I don't think Canadians in general would see it as anti-Trump to decrease our military spending, nor would they see military spending in the current context as merely being kowtowing to Trump, who says all the NATO members have to spend more on the military because they're not spending 2% of their GDP, which is an idiotic way of measuring military spending anyway. And even what is military spending? People make it up. I mean, when you build a highway to a military base, is that military spending or not? But I think there would be very little support in Canada among the electorate if you said, in response to Trump, we're going to say we're very different from you. We don't believe in the military, so we're going to spend less than we do now in the military.
Craig, did you want to weigh in on it, or I've got another question that's come up too, so don't have to. Okay.
Am I back? I'm back, am I?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Did you want to weigh in on about military spending, or I can just go to the next question?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, I think there has been a discursive shift. An NDP premier has, gone on record as saying that we have to be serious about the commitment in a cooperative organization that we're part of, and that WAPCanoe I'm talking about, and that at some level we have to face up to the fact that this has been a degree of free riding and hypocrisy in the part of Canada when it comes to military. All right, there we are. Multi-use military spending is absolutely the only thing I would want to talk about. So many ways in which we can be addressing humanitarian, climate, and other kinds of crises through dual use, multi-use capacity. And if you want to use bang for your buck language, you could do that. And the last thing is, look, were the first on the barricades or the protest lines, or saying yeah to Ukraine defending itself. And yet we don't want to acknowledge that that is being done militarily. We have to square some circles here.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm just going to move on to the next question from one of our audience members. The question is: today, the British Supreme Court ruled the legal definition of a woman excludes trans women. How worried should I be that that could happen in Canada? And who would I vote for to ensure that that couldn't happen? So really a question of, protecting people's rights, trans rights. This has certainly been an issue in Canada and a debate. Any thoughts or weigh in from any of you on that? Could that happen here?
I'll jump into it. Obviously, it could happen here because in some provinces there's big pressure to do
Mm-hmm.
that. Alberta and New Brunswick. On the other hand, we know the NDP is strong on that issue, and we happen to have a Liberal leader who is the father of a trans child. So he has that in his own life, as I have increasingly many friends who have trans people in their families and start to become enlightened about what that really means. So, which party? Historically, the NDP would be the best party. It has been the vanguard of pushing for LGBTQ rights. But currently, the current Liberal leader, by sheer chance, the right has tried to attack him on it. And to his credit, Jagmeet Singh jumped up when on social media and says, it is not okay to attack the Liberal leader's child. Okay, you get the fuck off it. Sorry. And we're not the Americans here. We don't do that in this country. So, and that was very a very good and courageous move on Jagmeet Singh's part. But I think we do have some hope in that. But we can see how we had such a huge shift when suddenly the fascists took over in the States in a frightening way, and it could not happen here. I am bitterly sickened and disappointed by the British Supreme Court justices. Who the hell are those people? Anyway, this is total nonsense. They were basing it on interpretation of legislation that said men and women, but what does that mean? Anyway, when they have the words men and women, it's frightening, sickening, and outrageous that a country like Britain that claims to be a country of rights would come up with that. And it was a result of the Scottish Parliament, not the British Parliament, recognizing trans rights, and then some right-wing nutcase, radical right-wing so-called women's group taking them to court, and then the Supreme Court unanimously makes that ruling. But don't kid yourself. The current Supreme Court in Canada would not do that. Not the current membership of the Supreme Court, some of whom I know, and they wouldn't rule that way. But you never know.
Thanks, Karl. Next question. This is kind of going, from here to there, but these are the questions that are coming in, so the things people are interested in. Is a vote for the Greens throwing away my vote? As a young person, I think it's the party I most identify with, but I've heard it's not worth it. Now, we don't have a Green Party representative here, and I'm sure they would love to answer that question, but if any of you have any thoughts, because it does get at this question of strategic voting, right? Do you vote out of who you want to stop, or do you vote for what you really believe in? And I think that's what this young person is getting at. Elle, yes, go for it.
And then I do have to go just because I have to go on to another show very quickly.
Okay,
so the transition. But unless you're in a riding where it's neck and neck, I think people misinterpret strategic voting. So you have to look at your own riding. So yes, if it's like tied between Liberal and Conservative, you very much don't want a Conservative, then it might be. But people interpret it as like every vote. But we're not, of course, we're going riding by riding here. You're not voting, for Trump or something where it's a president. So in your riding, does it matter? So I generally think people should vote what they want to vote. I think otherwise it's an incredibly alienating experience to vote and vote against your values and then be repeatedly told to do that. I think that's what exactly alienates people from the political system. You have to be able to believe that, if something suits my values, I vote for it, I encourage it, and I push it. Now, like if you do want a strategic vote, then it matters riding by riding. But people this is why we get the NDP in this situation, because people take this broad view of, you shouldn't vote NDP because it will split the vote, whether or not your riding is a historical NDP riding or not, like never goes Conservative. And this is the problem the NDP is running into. So I think we need to be really, I think the idea of strategic voting is very misinterpreted to being this global thing rather than a case-by-case basis. And in a very rare case, yes, like if your riding is tight, but for the most part, no, like vote green, like vote whatever you want to. So
Well, I'm sure they'll be glad to hear that. And I know it, I see a lot of nodding heads on the panel. And I have to say, yesterday I was talking to an elderly couple who had voted in the advance poll in Vancouver Centre, and they said to me, "Oh, we really, really wanted to vote for Avi Lewis, but," and I said, "And?" "Well, they voted Liberal because," and I said, "because you're afraid of the Conservatives." "Yes." And I had to explain to them that the Conservative was not an issue in that riding. It's just, the person is just not even visible. And they kind of looked at me and went, "Oh." So you're right. It's so misinterpreted. Bye, Elle. Thanks for joining us. So it's so misinterpreted. And I know we've talked about strategic voting a lot and how it can be almost used in a way that can backfire. So anybody else want to weigh on that? Because we're just a short response. We're getting close to the end now. 30 seconds. Anybody else?
Ella's correct. And the fact is, you have to you should be familiar. I live in Ottawa Centre, where the Conservatives haven't done better than third in God knows how many, in decades and decades and decades. So I would feel we have a great NDP candidate here. I think sadly he's likely to lose. There's a Liberal incumbent who.
That's Joel Harden, right?
It's Joel Harden.
Yeah.
But I still think that it would be there'd be no risk in voting NDP here, or Green for that matter. And I think you have to, but I think unfortunately, sadly, people don't understand the complexity of their of our political system, which is it's only one vote and it's only one member per riding. But you just have to understand the nature of your riding. There's many ridings in Canada where the Conservatives have not been a factor historically and are not likely to be a factor in this election. If there was a huge wave for the Conservatives where they may take very unlikely ridings the way the NDP did in Quebec in 2011, but nobody sees that now.
Right, thanks. Well, I know it's a question a lot of people are struggling with. Anybody else just with a quick response? Craig, I know Toronto, big. And Jennifer, you're in Toronto too.
I'm in Toronto.
It's a huge issue in Toronto, strategic voting, and people just, going all over the place. Any wise words of counsel to people? Very, very fast.
Jennifer?
I'm always hesitant to tell a young person to vote against their values and where they feel they're best aligned. I think that's part of the problem with our system as it stands right now, right?
Absolutely.
Is that we spend a lot of time telling people to not vote with their conscience, and not vote with their values. And Toronto is a complex place, and I am skeptical that Fortress Toronto is going to hold on election day. I really, really am. I live in a Liberal Conservative swing riding, that provincially the Liberals lost by 160 votes, and that candidate is running it back and flipped it and is the federal candidate here. Will he win? I don't know. But I also wouldn't say don't vote for an NDP or a Green candidate because you feel like that's a waste of your vote. No vote is a waste of a vote.
Right. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. Okay. Well, Craig, I'm afraid we do have to.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah,
I would get going on proportional representation if you let me. So.
Yeah, there you go. Yes, we'd all be a lot better off because then your vote would really count. Well, that's all the time we have for the questions, and I really want to thank you guys. Wonderful guests today, Craig, Elle, Karl, and Jennifer. Thank you for joining us. Our next Off the Hill will be May 21st, so please mark that. And just a thank you to Rabble, as always, for hosting tonight's panel. And I just want to say this. Friday is Rabble's 24th anniversary. Like, this is pretty amazing. Maintaining, sustaining independent, progressive media in Canada is really, really hard to do. And Rabble's done it for 24 years. So happy birthday, Rabble. And you can show your support by becoming a monthly donor. This is something that's very important. It doesn't have to be a lot of money, but a monthly donor is really, really critical. So if you want to do that, please go to rabble.ca, donate, and help Rabble grow, help Rabble share the kind of stories that you want us to follow. particularly as the new Canadian Parliament gets underway. So thank you to everybody for joining us tonight, and we'll see you at the next Off the Hill, May 21st. Thank you.